Welcome back. In this video, we're going to now try to understand how we think about price levels and price level changes in an economy. So, let's start with, in your book, something called the price index. A price index essentially takes GDP, which is another way of saying output, in 1 year at that year's prices, and remember, GDP measured at a current year's prices is going to be the nominal GDP, and I'm going to divide it by the output in that year valued at a previous year's prices, the base year. And so that would be like saying the real GDP. Another way to look at it, since we have been really focusing on growth rates or changes in these things, a change in, by the way, is nothing more than a growth rate. Growth rates can be positive or negative. If I want to look at it in terms of changes, I can say that the way to measure the price level, the way to measure the change in a price level, rather, is the change in that year's nominal GDP divided by the change in real GDP. Now recall, these are all the things that are included in these formulas. The change in nominal GDP is the same thing as the nominal GDP growth rate. The change in real GDP is the real GDP growth rate, and it's going to be 1 year's output measured by a base year's prices. That's exactly what we have right up here. Lastly, we have the change in the price level, which is going to be like the price index or something we call the inflation rate. You've heard that before. A change in price level is measuring nothing more than the inflation rate. That's usually measured by either the CPI or a GDP deflator. There will be more on that in this video. So how do we calculate the price index with some real numbers? Well, let's go back to this three-good economy we have. And let's say the 2012 price index, the way we calculate it is I take the output in 2012 valued at 2012 prices, which would have been $400, and the output divided by the output in 2012 valued at the base year prices, and since the base year is 2012, then it's also going to be $400. In the base year, since the base year is 2012, the price index should be precisely 1. Now, 2013 is going to be a little more interesting because it's not the base year. So first I'm going to value 2013's output, or its GDP, in terms of 2013 prices, which is essentially like saying it is the nominal GDP for 2013. And then I'm going to divide it by the GDP, or the output in 2013 valued at the base year's prices, which is essentially like saying real GDP. Well, nominal GDP divided by real GDP gives me 1.04. Now, if I just look at the part to the right of the decimal, I see that prices have increased by 0.04. If I move that decimal place 2 places to the right, I find that that's like saying prices in the economy have risen by 4%. Now let's pretend that three-good economy was actually our friends in Argentina. There we go. Get our slides to work here. Remember, the base year is 2012. I have my nominal GDP information, which we've already calculated previously, and I have the real GDP information. I had already learned that the real GDP growth rate was 6.25%, and the nominal GDP growth rate for 2013 was 10.5%. If I want to look at another way to calculate the price level, I take all that information and I basically plug it in to this particular formula, which says that the change in nominal GDP, in other words, the nominal GDP growth rate, is nothing more than adding the price level change to the real GDP change. Well, in this problem, I know that the nominal GDP change, the growth rate of nominal GDP, was 10.5%. I don't know the change in price level, but I do know that real GDP increased by 6.25%. If I put all those together, what I discover is that the change in prices in that economy from 2012 to 2013 was 4.25%. This is a lot like saying this economy had inflation of 4.25%. Now, we keep saying that price indexes or price indices come in two major forms, and you do need to understand the distinction. Most economies use both of them. The first one is easy. We call it the GDP deflator. And it is a price index that puts all the goods and services of the entire economy into one bundle, and it looks at what the average price of all those goods and services did between two different time periods. However, that's going to include things like, let's say, helicopters. Are helicopters a regular part of most people's daily buying pattern? No, not really, though. Say the U.S. economy does produce helicopters, and it is a final good and service. Good or service, it's a good. So, in some senses, it makes sense to include it as part of a bundle of all of the things that can be purchased in the economy. But in other ways, it kind of doesn't make sense because it's not a regular part of people's purchases, and that's why most economies also have something called the Consumer Price Index. We call it usually the CPI. And this is a price index that puts typical household purchases into its bundle. So the overall GDP deflator is the change in overall prices in an economy, whereas the CPI measures the change in prices from one time period to another time period in a very specific household level bundle. In the United States, what's included in the CPI? Well, we include a lot of different food and beverage goods. We include a lot of the prices of housing things, for instance, rent, or if you're an owner, your mortgage payment and your maintenance fees. It includes things like fuel oil and furniture, transportation, clothing, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and it also does include sales tax. Now, what's not included in the U.S. CPI? Things like any investments that you make, the value of any of those, because that's considered savings, not spending. Any real estate investments you have, the cost of your life insurance, and the income tax. Looking over the past 100 years or so, just about, in the United States, we see that the inflation rate measured by the CPI has gone all over the place, especially in the early part of the last 100 years. Certainly stabilized in the last 20 years or so. In Argentina, in just a particular 10-year period, we find that the price level was a little bit more stable than we see in the early years of the United States. Now, how do we move from nominal to real GDP? We have to find a deflator, which is essentially a price index. It can either be the GDP deflator, which is the overall price level, or a particular consumer price index. You find your base year, and you find what was the price level of that price index in your base year. And then for every other year you analyze, you take the information, the GDP, and you divide it by the base year's CPI price level. So, looking at some selected CPI data, this is the United States in 3 different years. The CPI price level in 1938 was 1410. In 1968, 34.8, and in 2012, 229.59. Now, in order to find out what will my actual multiplier be for each of the years, I take, since I've decided to make 2012 my base year, I take 1938's price level and I divide it by 2012's price level. Same thing for 1968. I take 1968's price level and I divide it by 2012's price level. When I do it for 2012, you notice I end up getting 1 because it is the base year. Now I take that multiplier, because this is what I just solved for, and then I multiply it, I divide it into the nominal GDP of each of the years in question. Well, GDP in 1938 was $87.4 billion. I take that amount, I divide it by my answer from the previous slide, and I find out that in 2012 dollars, if I were going to compare 1938's GDP to 2012's GDP in 2012 terms, I would discover that 1938 had a GDP equivalent of $1.4 trillion. In 1968, it was the equivalent of $6.2 trillion, and in 2012, well, if I divide anything by 1, I come up with the same answer, so it was $16.163 trillion. How would I do this for an individual, let's say? Well, your book gave you an example of a store, and they're looking at the last 5 or 6 years of their sales, and they see, well, in 2000 I had $21 million of sales. Then it went up to 22.3 to 22.9, and all the way up 5 years later to 24.7. I also know each year this was the CPI for each of those years. Well, how can I take that information and figure out what was the real sales growth? Well, I take each year's CPI and I divide it by the 2000 CPI because I've determined that's my base year, which means the price index for 2000 would of course just be 1. For 2001, I take 177.1 divided by 172.2 and I get 1.03, and I go all the way through and I find out my price index, assuming my base year is 2000. Then I take all those nominal sales amounts and I divide. So $21 million of sales divided by a price index of 1 says that my sales in 2000 in terms of $2,000 was $21 million. Well, if I keep going through, I see that in terms of real dollars, my sales certainly grow at a slower rate than they did in a nominal sense, and they actually, between 2003, 2004, and 2005, I actually see that sales are going down. Notice that, they're going down. And that's because in each of these years, my price index is greater than 1. Any price index of greater than 1 says that if it is greater than 1, it means that I have inflation. As the inflation gets bigger, sometimes in terms of real sales growth, I've canceled it all out. That concludes this portion of Chapter 18. In the last video, we will cover circular flows of income and other ways to think about real GDP.